Welcome to a new story. On Halloween night 1984 there was a very terrible murder, but when the crime happened there was someone in hiding who had seen the crime from the beginning to the end. But who was that person? What did he see? And did he survive? Let's start by analyzing the story so we know what happened. Our story today happened in San Jose, California. The city at that time was a small, quiet, and safe city, and on October 31st, 1984, it was Halloween night, and all the city residents were celebrating. And everyone wore costumes, and the police were on alert because everyone wore masks and somebody might try to commit a crime. In fact, there was a crime in the city. The police received a telephone call from a person named Charles Albert. Charles, speaking in panic attack, said his wife had been stabbed inside the house and was covered in blood. Police and ambulances went to Charles's house, and a team of investigators also went. When they arrived, they found neighbors packed in front of Charles's house. Investigators entered the garden of the house and observed traces of blood on the ground. And they also found a mask for the face of the evil wolf, and it was clear that the mask was for adults, not a mask used by children. The investigators walked into the house. Behind the door they found Charles's wife, and she was soaked in a pool of blood. She had a lot of stab wounds with a knife about 60 centimeters long, and it was clear that her skull was broken. Her right arm was almost severed, and investigators heard the sound of a man screaming in the street. And this guy was Charles. Charles's clothes were bloodied. And he was screaming hysterically that the victim was named Doreen Albert. Doreen was pregnant, and she had a 4-year-old girl named Diana. The investigators came out to talk to Charles, but Charles was screaming and he wasn't cooperating with the investigators. And he said that he put his little girl and the neighbors. The investigators thought Charles was involved in the crime. Took him to the police station, and the paramedics took Doreen to the hospital, and then the cops came into the house to search him. The killer could have been still inside the house, or there could have been more victims inside the house. The house was scary, and the cops were walking very carefully. And, inadvertently, a policeman poked at a puppet that was on the floor. The policeman alerted his colleagues not to walk over the doll, in order to preserve evidence inside the crime scene, but the trauma was when the policeman was found to have tamped on a fetus rather than a puppet. The scene was so painful, and the crime was so horrible. How could someone kill a woman and take the fetus out of her stomach? And what's the reason for doing this crime? The police finished searching the house and found no one inside. The only suspect was Charles. Charles's little girl Diana and Doreen were still in the neighbor's house. Investigators started analyzing the crime scene, and they found that the crime happened right behind the door of the house, and that the killer had used a large, long knife, and there was a dead embryo on the floor, and also Doreen died before she got to the hospital, and there was a lot of blood in the house on the walls and the floor and even on the ceiling. The investigators guessed that Charles might have killed his wife because of a disagreement between them, and he accidentally killed his wife. Or Charles was drunk and didn't know what to do, and maybe someone else might have done it. A detective went to the neighbor's house and talked to baby Diana in order to know what she saw. Diana said she was sitting with her mother and watching TV. Some kids knocked on the door, so her mother went to the kids and gave them some candy. And her father Charles went to the supermarket to buy some food. 5 minutes after her father's exit, they heard a powerful knock on the door of the house. Her mother opened the door, but she didn't know what was waiting for her behind the door. Diana said her mother opened the door and started screaming. She told her daughter Diana to hide quickly, so Diana hid behind the sofa. Diana said the killer was a man wearing an evil wolf mask. After the killer killed her mother, he started looking for Diana to kill her. too. But he couldn't find her, and it seemed like the killer got out of the house. Diana was hearing pain from her mother, but she was scared and couldn't get out of the couch. She stayed in hiding until her father came back from the supermarket. Charles was shocked by the scene. He started screaming and looking for his daughter until he found her behind the couch. Charles called the neighbors and also called the police. And he put his daughter in the neighbor's house, and Charles was crumbling and screaming hysterically. The cops confirmed that the evil wolf mask that was thrown into the garden of the house was the same mask that the killer was wearing. Also, investigators noticed traces of blood in the garden of the house. The traces of blood stretched from the garden of the house to the sidewalk opposite Charles's house. And investigators have guessed that the traces of this blood may be the killer's blood. The killer may have suffered a wound to his body and was bleeding. The police started investigating Doreen's life, and they found that Doreen was born in California in 1952, and she was working in physiotherapy. And because of her work, she was able to meet her first husband, Michael Dennis. Michael was having a stutter speech problem, and he asked Doreen for help in order to be treated. And then he and Doreen got married, and they had a little boy named after him, Paul. Michael was a somber, antisocial person, and there were many differences between him and his wife, and in 1977 Michael and Doreen decided to separate, and the child stayed. Paul was with his mother, and Michael was entitled to take the baby over the weekend. Michael was sad because of his separation from his wife, but Doreen wasn't sad, and then she married Charles and they had their daughter, Diana. In 1980, a terrible thing happened in Charles and Doreen's house. He was in Charles's pool house, and the little boy Paul jumped inside the pool, and nobody paid attention to him until he drowned and died. That Michael was very sad because of the death of his young son, that his son was believed to have died because of Doreen's negligence, that he sued Doreen for the murder of his son. But the case failed, and the judge said that the death of the child was an unintended accident and accidentally occurred. The investigators, when they knew this information, thought Michael might have been involved in the crime. And the investigators guessed that Michael might want revenge on Doreen and Charles. Detectives started searching for Michael and immediately went to his house. All these events were happening the same night as the murder. Investigators arrived at Michael's house at about 1 a.m. They knocked on the door a lot, and they heard from inside the house the sound of someone taking a shower. Several minutes later, Michael opened the door. Investigators walked into Michael's house, and they told him that his ex-wife was dead. Michael was surprised by the news of his wife's death, and he was calm and put his hand in his pocket, and because of his calm, the investigators thought Michael was not involved in the crime. Although he hated Doreen but did not kill her, the investigators asked Michael to search the house. Michael was cooperating with them and agreed to search the house. But investigators were surprised that Michael put his right hand in his pocket. And he wanted to sign the search request with his left hand, and he was clearly not good at writing with his left hand. The investigators asked him to write with his right hand, and when he pulled his right hand out of his pocket, the investigators noticed that his hand was wounded and was bleeding. And one of the investigators asked Michael what caused the wound in his hand. Michael said he was cutting the tomatoes and accidentally cut his hand. Michael's looks were weird, and that made the investigators worried and cautious. During the search, they found traces of blood in front of the house and on the wheel of Michael's car. And they also found a gun in his bedroom. That evidence was enough for investigators to think Michael was the killer. Michael was the first suspect in the Doreen murder case, and the police transferred him to the police station for investigation. Charles had calmed down and was able to talk to the investigators. And Charles said it was impossible for him to kill his wife, He said he had gone in order to buy some food from the supermarket. When he came home, he found his wife murdered. The police immediately went to the supermarket and made sure Charles's words were true. And there were cameras inside the supermarket, and they found in the recorded shoot that Charles was actually buying food. And Charles said that his clothes were bloodied when he tried to help his wife. Michael said he never got out of the house. He was in the house from 4 p.m. and did not leave the house until the investigators arrived. While the crime was about 9:30 p.m., investigators asked him if he had the evil wolf mask, and Michael said he never had the evil wolf mask. The next day, the detectives came back to search Michael's house again, and they noticed that there were 2 wood coffins in the garage, and they were tied to heavy iron weights. In addition to numerous nautical maps, investigators have guessed that Michael was planning to kill Charles and his wife Doreen and put their bodies in the coffins. And then he throws heavy coffins deep into the sea, and they find a purchase bill that proves Michael's purchase of a big knife at an arms store. But all this evidence was insufficient to convict Michael, and the police could not detain Michael more than 48 hours for the investigation, and the next day they released Michael. During the search of Michael's house, an investigator found a paper with Michael's friends' phone numbers written on it. The investigator took this paper and contacted all of Michael's friends. The detective was asking Michael's friends if they had information about Michael's acquisition of the evil wolf mask. And it was a surprise when one of Michael's friends said that the previous year she was celebrating with Michael on Halloween. Michael was then wearing an evil wolf mask. The detective was surprised by this information, and he went straight to Michael's girlfriend's house. That Michael's girlfriend had a picture of Michael wearing an evil wolf mask. The detective kept the photo because it was strong evidence of Michael's involvement in the crime. The mask worn by Michael in the photo was the same as the one they found in the garden of Charles's house, but Michael denied being in the photo and said that maybe this is someone else's picture and anyone can wear or buy that mask. Here, investigators began searching for evidence to prove that Michael was wearing the mask in the photo. The investigators found that Michael had been able to deny possessing the evil wolf mask, but he can't deny having the clothes he wore during the photo shoot. The investigators went to his house and searched the wardrobe, and they found the same clothes that were in the picture. This is strong evidence that Michael was the one in the picture. Finally, the investigators were able to establish the evidence of Michael's involvement in the crime, and he's the owner of the mask, and he's the killer, and he's been arrested for murder. Michael hated Doreen and her husband, Charles, and he sought revenge against them. So he decided to go to Charles's house on Halloween night wearing an evil wolf mask, and to kill Charles and Doreen, and he wanted to kill their daughter Diana. But his plan didn't work out, and he could just kill Doreen and the fetus. And he accidentally cut his hand when he was stabbing Doreen, and after finishing the crime he got out of the house and got into his car and drove off to the seaside. And there he got rid of the knife and his blood-stained clothes. But what's strange is that Michael left the mask in Charles's house. Investigators have guessed that Michael grabbed the mask and threw it in the garden of the house because Michael had poor vision. The mask was bloodied, making seeing through it difficult. And Michael took the mask off in order to see better and threw it in the garden of the house. For years after the crime, Michael Dennis' trial began. Michael was on death row, and the only witness to the crime was Charles and Doreen's daughter Diana. Diana was 8 years old at the time of Michael's trial. When Diana walked into the courtroom, she was afraid to see Michael. The judge asked Michael to stand behind the wall. Diana had said that the killer was wearing an evil wolf mask. Diana's speech was strong evidence of Michael's involvement, but the lawyer defending Michael told the judge that Michael had done the crime but had done it because he was mad. He was sick because of his son's death. confused and unable to think properly. But the judge didn't care about this justification, and in 1988 Michael Dennis was sentenced to death. Death penalty due to the killing of Doreen and the killing of the fetus, but the death sentence has not yet been carried out, and now Michael is 71. Charles has lived for many years and is influenced by what happened to his wife. And he blamed himself for coming out of the house the night the crime happened, but his daughter Diana tells him she would have lived without her parents if he had been at home during the crime. Diana said that she had been able to overcome this traumatic incident because she had not seen her mother killed, and that she just remembered the beautiful moments she had with her mother. This is the end of our story today. I hope you have been impressed, and don't forget to support our channel now. Good night.